You say you sort of slept.
My app says my sleep score is now above average.
That's not hard to do after last week, right?
That I got an hour and a half of REM, an hour and 11 minutes of deep sleep. My latency to fall asleep was 3 minutes, which is less than ideal. My total
What
sleep.
does that mean, the latency to fall asleep?
How quickly you fall asleep.
It only took 3 minutes? That's
It means
very fast.
It means I was fucking exhausted.
Right. What's a normal number for that?
I think they say between 5 and ideally falling asleep shouldn't take more than 15 to 20 minutes. Falling asleep immediately in less than 5 minutes could be a sign you're not getting enough sleep for your needs.
Oh my God, I got to get one of these things. It's a ring that you wear.
It's a
Can
ring.
you explain to the audience?
Are we going to get sponsored? It's just called an Oura ring, O-U-R-A. And you wear
They're
it.
not our sponsor. We don't have sponsors, just so you know. I'm just curious about this thing that he wears.
We're
sponsoring
sponsored by
them.
We're sponsored by the Desert Air.
Yeah. And quite a surprisingly social life for being in the middle of the nowhere, 2 miles up a dirt road. Patrick came here with the thought that he was going to have solitude, and that hasn't happened. But we have what's nice is that the people we hang out with, it's a select and wonderful few. And I've been really just so surprised at the caliber of people I meet up here. I remember when Mark Rathel, my dear friend, who you'll be hearing a lot about if you haven't already, he's a professor at Oxford, and he was getting his PhD at Berkeley when I was an undergrad, and we both had Dreyfus as our mentor. And when I first got this place, he came to visit me, and I was all proud to show him. I was so proud to show him this place, and he had this very, kind of severe, sad look on his face. And I said, "What's wrong? You don't like it?" And he says, "No, I can't imagine you up here in the middle of nowhere. You're such a social person." And he was just genuinely worried about me being alone up here. And I think I've been here 4 years. I think probably 10 nights out of those 4 years I've been completely alone on the property here.
Wow.
And the maybe 20, but it's very unusual that it happens between Airbnb, between people living here, between friends of friends. In LA, when you meet somebody, there's this thing that everybody experiences, which is people kind of look past you at the door in the restaurant to like who's coming in, and there's always a sense of like what happens next. And this is in every city, I think. When you hang out with somebody, you get like 20 minutes of their time, a half an hour, maybe 2 hours if you're really good friends, but there's always something coming right up afterwards. What's so unusual about living in a rural, isolated place like this is that when people come to visit, you have days to commune with that person and have like meaningful experiences with them. And then of course in LA, the cliche of people being, everybody being in the movie business or entertainment, there's a kind of like inherent narcissism to the kind of industry that it's based around, and it's a one industry town more or less. I mean, there's tech now too, and obviously there's other things. It is a giant city of 10 million people.
It's not just movies. There's also television.
Yeah, and internet. But I think that being out here, thanks to Airbnb and thanks to the flow of guests that I get a much bigger variety of types of person who comes here. So I see scientists and people who work in ecology or in politics and from all over the world. And it's deeply ironic and paradoxical that I have a more rich kind of social fabric living literally 2 miles up a dirt road with not the sound of one car. And
apropos my sleep app, is it the depth of the communication that matters? There's different stages of sleep, right?
Yeah.
There's different stages of social interaction. Like, is it the depth once they're here that it takes course of days?
Oh, absolutely. I think
it's
so.
like the REM sleep of social interaction.
It's the depth and it's the quality of people. It's a self-selecting group. I've also done certain things to kind of ensure that I don't get too many like quote unquote like square or normal people here. Like my Airbnb listing says, there's nudity allowed, there's no children allowed, so that there's a very liberal environment is fostered, and that's nice because I think there's everybody's interesting in some way, but there's definitely types of people who are more like boundary pushing or experimental in their way of life, and this place seems to attract those types of people, and it's nice. It's nice. I always look forward to who's going to appear next, and more than in a city. I had a neighbor once say, when I was expressing surprise like a few months into living here at how I was never alone, and he said, "Oh yeah, when I want to be alone, I go to LA," and that pretty much said it all for me.
I think in Manhattan a couple of years ago, I don't know the exact year, single occupancy households became more than 40 or 50% of the total kinds of households. Mm-hmm. And so it's just amazing, this like kind of epidemic of loneliness, often in the middle of massive urban centers, where it's just it's the kind, it's just the kind of social interaction you can have, and people think it's impossible to feel alone in New York, but I don't think I've ever felt more alone in New York.
Same, definitely. So the other night we had a lovely group of people gathered here, and I don't remember what we were talking about, but I was reminded of one of my favorite books, and we'd been talking about translation earlier in the day by coincidence, for reasons that will become apparent when Patrick opens the book that he brought. we both brought books today.
We're having book club.
But one of the most exciting and erotic and wild pieces of literature I've ever read, or passages I've ever read, happens to be 2,000 years old, and from the only novel that survives in its entirety from antiquity. And it's called The Golden Ass, which I also used as inspiration for a little short film I made for the Petit Hermitage Hotel a couple of years ago. Anyway, so I started reading this passage very excited about how kind of wild and just, you'll see when I read it, just kind of amazingly descriptive and funny and sexy. But I saw Patrick was kind of looking very skeptical as I read it, because he was wondering how much of what I was reading was the work of the translator versus the work of Apuleius, the ancient Roman who wrote the novel. And of course it's hard to determine that when you don't speak the original language, in this case Latin. But each translator always defends their approach, and they do seem to change from era to era. The other day I wanted to give my my then girlfriend a copy of the Odyssey to read, and I just posted on Facebook, "Hey, which translation is best of the Odyssey?" thinking maybe I'll get one or two recommendations. It was fierce debate. There were like 25 answers, and there were passionate defenders of Fitzgerald versus Latimer versus, and why are they all men translating this? There's actually now a woman who's translated, and you can feel that. And it just, suddenly I realized this is a really controversial topic, and one that we should talk about. So do you want to say a few words before I read the Apuleius passage?
Yeah, well, I kind of want to start with a small debate about this.
Yeah.
Do you think it's good that there are multiple languages in the world?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I speak Pi languages. I stole this idea from Hofstadter, but it's true. I speak Spanish and Italian and English quite well, almost 3, and then about 0.24 French, I would say. So adding up to 3.14. So people say you have different personalities in different languages. And my father said that's not a good thing. You should be able to switch language in the middle of a sentence, and he would do this from French to Italian to English, and have your tone stay the same, and have your personality stay the same. When your personality changes from language to language, it means you don't really dominate the language, that the language is somehow dominating you. But I've also noticed that, yes, so I speak Italian, but I left when I was 8, so I noticed that I'm less confident when I speak Italian, so my voice goes up a little bit. In Spain, I would hang out with all these kind of more rough people that had a really kind of more, fierce way of speaking, and so my voice might get a little more macho in Spanish.
And so that's the personality that they were talking about.
That's the personality thing, which I think is kind of cool.
But it's a reflection of an inner state of confidence. Maybe. For you, it's yours is a voice inflection kind of confidence, the way you carry yourself difference.
But it's also a way to a personality of the culture, I think, that comes out a little bit when you speak in that language. Like also even within a language, you have accents, right? So like there's people who famously like will put on a kind of cliche Roman accent when they speak Italian, and that's just more like rough in the voice like this. And when they do, they and then they all the L's are turned into R's, and with the rolled R's, it's just like a personality of the language is so different. And there are words that just are untranslatable, and that you have fun with someone who also speaks the same language to like throw in the word from that language, because you know that no one who doesn't speak that language and by association knows that culture, and therefore knows certain ways of being that somebody who doesn't just will never have access to.
Yeah, so there's this fundamental argument that there would be something lost if we all spoke one language.
Yeah,
right. That the things we would lose would be maybe some sort of history, some sort of cultural differentiation. I find this completely empty as an argument. Like
let's tell people you only speak one language.
Well,
right?
So that's a coincidence. I claim it's a coincidence. And I mean, I don't care what language it is. I'm happy if the one is Chinese or if the one is Italian. It doesn't have to be English. It doesn't have to be what I know. I just find it to be fundamentally upsetting that I cannot get dropped, like airdropped into rural China and understand or have a conversation with a farmer there, because I don't speak Chinese or Mandarin and they don't speak English. And I get it that there would be some sort of loss in, but Japanese have a concept for a type of sheared wood that we just don't have a word for. Or in German, there's Zugenruhe, the anxiety felt by a migratory bird prevented from migrating. And how could you possibly, why would you want to abolish that from the kind of like global brain of the world? Like, you want to remove those concepts? No, of course not. If everyone spoke the same language, those concepts wouldn't just go away. Accents would still exist. We would still have differentiated cultures. I mean, even think about all the types of people that speak English. I mean, this, of course, is what I know well. You still have Irish, you still have British, you still have all the
accents are so
kinds.
strong that we can't understand them.
So that's fine. I mean,
is
yes.
that fine?
Well, so
it
yeah.
seems like there's a very
it's a
gradation, right?
Well, but at the very least, maybe if they slow down or there's some sort of, I mean, yes, there's certain. Well, okay, so then, but in the thought experiment, though, there is no such thing as you understand everyone who's speaking on the planet.
Yeah.
Yes, you lose a certain kind of romance to the differentiation, but we would, I think, find other ways of differentiating, as we do within any homogenous single language speaking culture. You find ways. You'll still have social like hierarchy. You'll still have racism. If you might not have race, but you guys still have racism. I don't quite get it. I find it to be just a tragedy how little we understand each other. And language, to begin with, two people speaking the same language, it's already such a lossy compression algorithm. It's already so bad at actually getting at what it is like to be inside of someone's head.
That assumes that there is something that it's like to be inside before the language. I would argue that maybe the language helps formulate, that it's constitutive of what's on the inside.
Yeah, and then there's the Sapir-Whorf thing that, but different cultures, like kind of the language they speak predisposes them to categories of thought and kinds of perceptions because by virtue of the language itself. But I see no reason why the gain of having these differentiated languages does not pale in comparison to the fact that I cannot speak with most of the world. Like, why is that not the great tragedy?
Right.
To me, that's the great tragedy. I cannot, and I say this, yes, I only speak one language. Great. Okay. There might be someone that speaks 13. Right. Okay. Great. You're a polymath. Good for you. But that's still vastly underrepresentative of the amount of people you can talk to in the world. There's so many pieces of literature that I can't read, that aren't translated. There's so many things out there that are inaccessible. And I don't understand why that's not perceived as more of a tragedy than this. We'll still have different cultures of I guess you'd have to go all the way back and imagine just like a single language dominating the world.
I mean, the good news is for you is that it probably is going in that direction. If you look at the trends, like it used to be
English?
that a Roman couldn't understand a Neapolitan, and now those dialects are disappearing and they're just getting lost. Only the old people speak them, right? And there's some attempts at kind of keeping them alive, but I think it's a broader conversation about boundary definition, right? Like Look at the Catalan movement for, like preserving that culture. That is a huge part of that is preserving the language and speaking Catalan instead of Spanish, right?
Because language often aligns with cultural differences. Like I'm totally all for preserving dead languages or dying languages or soon to be extinct languages now because they contain within them multitudes of culture and differentiation and history and the people. But that's only because we speak different languages. If we didn't, then the language itself would not be worth the you could find other ways to preserve the culture, the heritage, the history.
Yeah, if we all spoke the same language, it would probably be a bad idea to start creating different languages that only a subsection of the world could understand.
Yes.
I agree with that. But given the world as it is there is a loss when the languages are lost, I think.
Totally agree. 100%. Worth preserving, worth spending heaps of energy on.
And there's a difference between preserving a language in an academic way and preserving it in a living way, right? So like no one speaks Latin. We've preserved Latin, obviously, and we haven't lost any of that. But the Latin, whatever style of the culture that came out of speaking Latin is gone. And it's nice now that at least hopefully, you can film things and, have these amazing interactions. But I mean, there was have we already talked about the Neapolitan with all his 200 gestures? Yeah, we talked about that in another episode. But that's a language, that's a sign language.
Absolutely.
If in a way, better more people understand those signs than to get rid of the sign language and make everybody keep their hands still when they speak, right? So maybe there's a world in which all of our brains are enhanced in a way that we can just be fed all the information of all the languages and be bridged to each other, and then have just instead of eliminating and having only one language, which I think would be limiting. If we all spoke English or we all spoke Chinese, a huge thing would be lost. But if we all could just understand when someone Chinese speaks and have our brain enhanced in such a way that we could speak all the languages, that seems the ideal solution to me.
So you maintain
I'm handing you a.
You're trying to hand me a solution.
No, I'm trying to hand you a switch of conversation into something you want talking about.
Well, so the reason I brought it up though was because you wouldn't have had to ask on Facebook which is your favorite translation of the Odyssey, and there wouldn't have been a huge debate about it. Right? You would have just read the Odyssey, and so I think actually the greatest loss would be in some sense that there'd be no translation art.
Right.
And I wonder about that. Like this book, the book that I brought wouldn't exist. Your translation might not have the same flavor. Maybe Roman ethics or mores evolved, and the translator kind of evolved to modernize it a little bit when they did. And so like maybe it would be completely unintelligible.
Right.
I don't know. If you try to read a book of jokes from previous centuries, they're just nonsense.
Right.
And so like things just don't bridge across centuries sometimes.
Although I took this amazing folklore class at Berkeley with Alan Dundes, who was just like the most famous folklorist who ever was. And he had this history of jokes, and it was amazing. Some of them, there was a Sumerian joke that was like 6,000 years old. And it was something, and again, maybe this was like enhanced by translation, but it was business before pleasure, said the man, kissing his wife before kissing his neighbor's wife. And that was surprisingly funny. For something 6,000 years old.
A good adultery joke. It's transgenerational.
Yes. Anyway, go on.
Well, so I think one of the greatest losses would be translation science, because I love watching and noting the ways that different brains kind of carve out the same input into different outputs. Like to me, that's data. To me, that's enjoyable. Mm-hmm. So the world in which everyone spoke one language, you would lose to things like this. We would just pick up. So, yours is 2,000 years old. What did you say?
Yeah, 2,000.
And so this one, the book that I brought is this Chinese poet from 800 AD. So like, 12, 1,300 years old. And it strikes me, I guess, is there the original Latin of the Golden Ass that still exists?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so they have the original. I don't know.
Discovered in the Middle Ages. We haven't talked about swerve, but this is, I think, part of that whole.
Oh, was it? It was part of that.
Yes.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, that's great.
Maybe.
Yeah, it's not obvious to me that we gain more by having all this differentiation than we lose. That's I guess my only point.
Yeah.
No, it's just such a tragedy to me. I mean, I feel this in romantic relationships, that I feel like there's a tragedy of translation between myself and the other person. If someone has a brain injury and they're in a room full of neurologists, the neurologist will ask them a bunch of questions and they don't figure it out. And they're like, this person seems fine. Maybe they can be missing their entire like prefrontal cortex. And there's a famous case study doing exactly that. And the point of that is not that the neurologists don't know what they're doing. The point of that is not that the guy is not damaged. His brain is not damaged. The point is language does not sufficiently get across all aspects of cognition. Language is an inherently highly, highly lossy compression algorithm.
But that's because you're making this metaphor of compression and computers and everything, and I think that might be only so useful. I think that we have to also look at, it's like, is music, again, I'm speaking to somebody who doesn't speak more languages and doesn't love music, so it's hard to like see this, but to say that when I play the guitar, I'm only doing a pale imitation of what ideally I could do musically seems an absurd statement. Like what you're able to do with the guitar is more than you can. And it's both constrained and allowed for by the instrument. And I would argue that language has that's a similar quality.
Like, right? This is the instrument.
Yes.
Yeah. This allows more expression than just the internal simulated. That's interesting. That's kind of beautiful. I like that.
And there's filmmakers. This is an argument that I was very interested in becoming a filmmaker. So there's two approaches to filmmaking, I think. One is the Alfred Hitchcock idea. And he said, I write a script and I can't wait for the day that I just put the script into a computer or machine and out comes the movie as I actually want it. Instead, I make a series of compromises. At every step, I lose something. And the movie in the end is just a pale imitation of what I wanted it to be to begin with. And I hate it.
That's how I feel about language.
Exactly. That's your point of view.
Yes.
Right. And so when he imagines the ideal blonde, and then he has to take a real blonde that's going to have all the flaws of a human that he didn't imagine when he had this. It's a very platonic way of seeing the world, right? Mm. Then there's the kind of Godards and Truffauts of the world, or even Fellini, who said, Fellini famously, like his producer came up to him when he was making Satyricon, I think, and said, "Oh my God, it's a disaster. Someone else is working on a movie based on the same ancient Roman tale." And Fellini had the script on his desk, and he said, "Give them my script and let them shoot from my script, because this is going to be a completely different film, right?"
Yeah, that's great.
The script was just a vague. The script was the lossy thing.
Yeah.
Because it will never have the richness that the world has, right? Yeah. And so when a Fellini or a Truffaut went into the world to make the movie, they were then able to get, when they saw the actor, it was 10,000 times more rich than what they had imagined.
Yeah.
And this is, again, a deep, deep philosophical difference, I think, between a world of ideals that is lost in translation on the way in, mm-hmm. and a world of maybe, very vague notions that attain meaning and beauty and significance when they manifest and concretize into something real. And I think that there's a fundamental difference between those two worldviews.
I once wanted to kind of understand the muscle memory of script writing, right? Because it has its own syntax and cadence and everything. And I know the thing I've heard you're supposed to do is you take one and you just type it. You just copy it from scratch just to learn. And I was like, okay, great. I want to understand this format. And so I took some scripts from films that I liked. I went backwards in time, retro translation, and found some, but who I usually like are writer-directors. And so I ended up finding all these scripts from writer-directors, which were terribly deficient in all of the instruction and the ways in which you would otherwise turn a script into a film, because they were writing it themselves, knowing that they were going to be the ones filming it. So if you read like Barry Lyndon, Kubrick's thing, right? I was like, okay, great. It's one of the most beautiful films of all time. There must be something inherent. It's just dialogue after dialogue, and then like outside scene, in bracket, like,
really?
Yeah,
really?
Like external field. Yeah. And I'm like, fuck. And it's because he didn't need to do the hermeneutic, like translation steps, right? And so I realized that it's my enterprise was entirely it was doomed for failure, because I liked the writer director, and they don't write everything down because it's already in their head.
Yeah, exactly.
You need to find a script written by that exists on its own that someone then picked up to do the muscle memory thing.
Supposedly, I was watching the I was watching the DVD once of the behind the scenes for Chinatown, and when my parents met, they were at Roman Polanski's house, and my mother said that he was complaining about having to do this movie that seemed so boring about water in LA, and what is he going to do with this script? But they were offering him so much money that he couldn't say no, and I didn't know if I believed this story, but then it was confirmed when Robert Towne, who wrote the script, was talking about getting a beginner's screenwriter's book from Polanski, Screenwriting 101, signed with hope. That's how dismissive he was of the whole enterprise, right?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, this is a great screen, and supposedly they worked on it together, and they butted heads, and it happened in the best way you could imagine, and two geniuses come together, and like this masterpiece is born, right? But I do think that the movie's always more than the script. It's the idea that the movie, that the Hitchcock's idea that the movie is less than the script is inconceivable to me, because I'm so much in that other camp, though. I see the richness of the world, the richness of the words that come out right now. There's not some idealized conception of these things I'm trying to say to you that I'm saying more badly. Yes, sometimes I'll search for a word that I wish I could find faster, but the thoughts are being manifested and iterated as I speak. And I don't think it's like, I don't think there's some ideal thought in here that is then coming out in some imperfect copy. I think that the words themselves are the thoughts.
It's not so much the direct kind of alchemy of thought to expression of thought that I'm interested in, because I think thoughts themselves in many people are proto-linguistic acts. So like it actually makes sense that there's not much loss, to use my compression algorithm. What I'm mostly thinking about is the kind and way that your inner world works. Is we don't often have words to describe the difference between people's capacity for visual imagination. We don't have, it took a while for us to figure out, and I had to say it out loud, that I'm not musically inclined. I don't hear things, but you still don't know what that feels like for me.
Yeah, no idea.
And I still don't know what it feels like for you to listen to a piece of music. We can use words, but they completely miss everything. Yeah. We're talking in abstracts, but we truly don't understand what it's like to be in each other's heads. That's what I'm talking about when I say I'm missing. That's what I'm talking about when I just had this piece that come out this week in Nature, a science fiction piece about brain bridging. And the idea is like your left and right hemispheres of your brain right now, they're connected, right, by this corpus callosum, this kind of bridge that connects the two and allows for this integrated whole to appear, to emerge between the two hemispheres. We don't feel like we have two separate identities that clash, other than, psychoanalytically. And the thought experiment is, if you could connect my brain, kind of make an artificial bridge between our brains, what would then happen? And we argued, I co-wrote this with Christoph Koch, and we argued that at the moment of crossing a certain threshold of bandwidth, of connectivity between the two brains, suddenly a thing would appear, and that thing would be Tao Patrick. It would be both of us together, and we would not be able to then distinguish or differentiate back into our piecemeal parts. We would just be one thing. And we would not have to translate across each other. We would not have to use language to speak. We would just think the same thing. Our memories would be shared. Mine would be yours would be mine, and it would just merge. And that, to me, is a fully translationless connection between two brains. That's the Platonic ideal that I want in a relationship. That's, to me, the most beautiful way of understanding another mind, would be doing this bridging with it, having a brief moment where you do not have to translate, having this brief moment where thoughts and ways of seeing the world, and you might understand finally what it's like for me not to hear music. Or maybe we would have some sort of like compromised middle where you would suddenly be terrible at flamenco guitar because I brought you down by half.
But yeah, then maybe you get rid of this temporal aspect too. I think about this often, like if you could make an AI that was able to just like read all the books, it can probably read them all in an instant, or just have them fed into it, right? Google has already scanned all the books. So as soon as we figure out how to make the AI read the books, it won't take it the time it takes a human to read the books. A human will never be able to read all the books, right? And it'll take and we have that process of ingesting it and where we were sitting while we were reading the book and the richness of that experience, and the AI will just have all the books in it already. So that's kind of cool. I wish I could have all the books, but at the same time I feel like I'd be missing something by not having to read them, right? If we just had access to all of the information in that, right?
Yeah.
And so the same thing with not really knowing what it's like to be you, but having this conversation. It's like reading you as a book, right?
Oh,
It's
I see.
like,
Okay. It's like a skillful reduction, like because you're not getting everything.
yes, there's the process of learning, and there's a temporal side of it, obviously, that is essential. And I think I heard one of the most difficult things to get an AI to understand the world we do is the basic thing, that basic metaphysical facts about the world, that there are separate things and they have cause and effect on each other, and that happens over time, is nearly impossible to explain to a computer in a way that actually will understand it the way we do, right?
Yeah.
So
I was playing last year with one of these writing robots, right? OpenAI's GPT. At the time, it was GPT-2. I'm sure by the time someone listens to this, it'll be GPT-10. And
that'll be in an hour, right? We release these right after they come. They're really moving fast. Huh?
I still think there's a lag time before
most people will
maybe
listen.
the peak of our podcast popularity.
Yes, it's true.
But anyway, it just made this beautiful short story, but it was about a fire underwater. It was about like creating a fire in the middle of the ocean. And I was like, like it was just this basic thing that it was well written, it was coherent, but it was just about making a fire underwater. Yeah. And is this like essential logic is missing from a lot of these things. Yeah,
and that's why it's so hard for AIs to even have answer follow-up questions, because the information, according to Dreyfus and all the background, the idea of the background understanding is that you can't list all the facts about this room. Like, there are literally an infinite number of facts about this room, and we as humans have this kind of background understanding of what it is like to be human in the world, and that informs the way we experience it. So I think that's at the background of what we're talking about in a way that's difficult to make explicit.
But even when people read these artificially generated texts, or if they watch a video of shapes like moving around, you imbue that with a kind of intentionality, right? You imbue a prose piece, even if it's written by a robot, with a certain like story. You've kind of fill in the blanks. Your brain is still doing a lot of work to give credit to the story. It's trying to make sense of it. Mm-hmm. It tries to make sense of these shapes that run around and says, okay, there's, this person's being chased. That circle's afraid because the triangle's chasing it. To me, that's the desperate, like constant attempt of a brain to translate another mind or another person's output. And so to me, that's like devastating, because it means that even when I'm listening to you, I'm adding a layer of that. If I'm capable and willing to do it for a shape or for a text written by a robot, that means I'm also capable and willing to do it as you and I speak. And I'm adding this storytelling veneer, this translation veneer to all of my experience of what you're saying. And so to me, that means that there's something kind of fundamentally fraudulent about the act of communication that is mostly translation.
So I think we should, our podcast is going exact backwards than I expected it to. I thought we were going to start with The Golden Ass and then go into some your book and then go into some of this philosophical discussion. I think we've done it exactly backwards, and it's wonderful. And I think we should move into this, the perfect lead into you talking about the Chinese characters and this poet. And then I'd like you to read that first, and then I'm going to close with the most erotic and exciting passage ever to be written.
Of course. Yeah, this isn't erotic at all. Mine. So there's this book, 19 Ways of Looking at Wong Wei, that I've really loved. As a neuroscientist, I've searched for things that best describe the study of the brain and also the difficulty of studying the brain. And I have never encountered anything that captures the emotion of the difficulty of understanding brains than this tiny book, 19 Ways of Looking at Wong Wei. The reason being, the original poem, it's he's an 8th century, 9th century Chinese poet, Wong Wei. And he wrote a poem called, I don't actually know. Not because I don't remember it. It's just because if I gave you the name of it, that would be a translation. And the whole point of this is that the original poem is lost. And I call it Deer Park. That's my name for it. I believe the poem is called Deer Park. But the original is lost, and this book is just 19 different versions of that poem translated into English and French.
Wait, so
just
only
19
the translations
attempts.
exist?
Yeah, only the translations exist. That's
So we
why.
don't know
That's
the
why I
original
asked.
characters.
That's why I asked if the Golden Ass was, if the original was actually available in Latin.
So because I thought you showed me the other day that there were the Chinese characters, and there was a literal translation of the Chinese characters.
There is, but I believe that comes from a Chinese translation of it.
Oh.
Like it says somewhere in here that the original is completely lost.
So they've reconstructed it. They've reconstructed the original characters from a bunch of translations.
The poems were written as part of a massive horizontal landscape scroll, a genre he invented. The painting was copied, translated, for centuries. The original is lost. And the earliest surviving copy comes from the 17th century, Wang's landscape, after 900 years of transformation.
Oh, so they were copies, though, from Chinese to Chinese. So we assume that the original...
Yeah, so it's transliteration.
The original... The copies are copies of... We
but
can assume that they're...
So this is maybe our philosophical difference, because I find the poems were written as part of a massive horizontal landscape scroll, and it's a 4-line poem about a landscape. So I believe form matters for function. I believe that...
We agree on that.
Yeah. So but then I think the original is still lost, even if we have the character-by-character translation of the poem from the Chinese. It's sitting... It looks like this. It's just sitting on this page.
Right.
It's not a landscape. It's not a landscape scroll anymore. So just the thing that I love is like when reading this, I had to come to terms with the fact that the original was lost, that I did not have access to it, and that what I was reading would be fundamentally like a shadow version. And maybe it's enhanced. Maybe by virtue of the shadow, it's like, okay, the contrast is better. I see your point. Mm-hmm. But it's this thing where, to me, I felt like when I'm trying to translate subjective experience as well, when I'm trying to understand another brain, when I'm trying to understand another mind, trying to understand what it's doing, the original is lost. And I actually think the problems of translation are very similar to the problems of neuroscience. And so I'm going to give... I'll read like 3 or 4 versions. It's a 4-line poem, and then I'll read the direct character by character translation, which I believe is the best. Okay, so one version. The form of the deer. So lone seem the hills, there is no one in sight there. But whence is the echo of voices I hear? The rays of the sunset pierce, slanting the forest, and in their reflection, green mosses appear. Deer Park Hermitage. There seems to be no one on the empty mountain, and yet I think I hear a voice, where sunlight, entering a grove, shines back to me from the green moss. The Deer Park. An empty hill, and no one in sight, but I hear the echo of voices. The slanting sun at evening penetrates the deep woods, and shines reflected on the blue lichens. The forest. On the mountain everything is solitary. One hears from far off the echo of human voices. The sun that penetrates to the depths of the forest reflects its rays on the green moss. Dear forest. Through the deep wood, the slanting sunlight casts motley patterns on the jade-green mosses. No glimpse of man in this lonely mountain, yet faint voices drift on the air. The deer enclosure. On the lonely mountain I meet no one. I hear only the echo of human voices. At an angle, the sun's rays enter the depths of the wood and shine upon the green moss. No title. On the empty mountains no one can be seen, but human voices are heard to resound. The reflected sunlight pierces the deep forest and falls again upon the mossy ground. So that's like half the book. We're already halfway there. And so each of them, it's like they're getting at a tone. They're getting at a scene. It's visually evocative. It seems there's some sort of hill, can't hear anybody, but it's the absence of voices. It's not silence. It's the absence of human voices. And there's like a piercing ray of light coming through a various colored, maybe grove, maybe it's a tree, maybe it's and so as you start to read these, I think of it almost like an imaging problem. You're triangulating from 19 different sources. I don't know the Latin for 19 and the prefix for 19. And but if you want to understand something, you see it, you try to image it from multiple different angles to get its like three-dimensional shape.
Yeah.
That's what I love about the idea of this poem, that it's like coming from 19 different angles. And or rather this book. And so what I find so interesting is, so the character by character translation, it's 5 Chinese characters by 4 in pictograms, right? Or ideograms. And so I believe this is the best translation. And because some of them will have multiple different possibilities, right? So each one is not just literally a one-to-one mapping. So the first character, empty. Second character can be either mountain, mountains, hill, or hills. Third character, negative. Fourth, to see. Fifth, person, people. But, to hear, person, people. Words, conversation. Sound, to echo. To return. Brightness, shadow. To enter. Deep, forest. To return again. To shine, to reflect. Green, blue, black. Moss, lichen. Above, on, top. And every one of the translations just comes from this essential core, right? Everything I read before, it feels so superfluous and excessive. The like English language, all those fancy words and syllables, like I think this captures the essence of the thing. But and it relishes its own ambiguity.
Right.
Like the fact that the same character can mean both brightness or shadow. That's like a deep conflict about the nature of how you see the world.
Right.
And it's contained within that one character. And then every single translator from then on has to choose. They have to resolve the ambiguity, and I think the beauty of this is in its ambiguity. And that's why I find all the translations to be less than good. If you have 2 conflicting thoughts, but then in conversation you say one of them, you've resolved the ambiguity of the complexity of your mind into a single output. And I find that to be the thing that I most miss. Like I want to see the conflict in your brain in the same way that in that character by character translation, you see the conflict.
And that's why you chose to be a neuroscientist, and I chose to be whatever I chose to be. I don't even know yet.
There you go. That's the conflict.
Exactly. So this is translated by Jack Lindsay in 1960. And I would love if there are any Latin speakers out there who are able to find the original of this and post in the comments a literal translation of this passage. I would just die to see that. And then we could argue about whether it is better or this is better, and how much liberty has Mr. Lindsay taken in this beautiful, I think, beautiful translation. But again, that's an aesthetic consideration too, right? Like we don't know, obviously there's taste involved, right? That's why the debate on the Odyssey, right? Probably none of those people had read the original Greek, or actually, I do know one of the people who had. But their own practices, their understanding of the languages translated into, their understanding of what it is to be human because you can imagine a world that was so different from the world of the Odyssey that it would be unintelligible to everyone, even if you did have the right words, right? But we depend on a shared experience, I think, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's fun also to realize like that, certain things about being human do seem to be not universal, but definitely last a long time. Who knows if we'll still be having sex and flirting and when we become transhuman and become merged with machines or whatever. But for the time being, I understand that Milo, our hero, he wanted to understand magic, and he wanted to understand magic by going into the household of a woman who he knew had magical powers and piss her off so that she would maybe cast a spell on him, and he could see what it's like to have a spell cast on him. And this is what happens, and she turns him into a donkey, and he spends most of the book wandering around the Roman Empire as a donkey trying to get turned back into a human. But before he gets turned into a donkey, the way he's going to piss off his host is by seducing her maid and cook, whose name is Fotis. And so this is when he he arrives, and he's been thinking about seducing her, and he's then sees her and how beautiful and hot she looks cooking the tripe, and so he decides to. He says, "I reached Milo's front door and entered with the question answered, as the saying goes, overwhelmingly in the affirmative. I did not, however, find Milo or his wife at home." Oh yeah, sorry, Milo is the host. It's not the narrator. My bad. My darling Fotis was alone in charge. She was preparing the stuffing for some black pudding and was mincing the pig's tripes, some of which stood finely shredded on the sideboard, ready for mixing with a gravy that tickled my nostrils with its succulently wafted steam. She was neatly clad in a linen apron with a shining scarlet stomacher which gathered her dress up high under her meeting breasts, and she was stirring the stock pot with her rosy little hands, moving around and around above it. And she stirred and turned the meat. As she stirred and turned the meat, she herself stirred and vibrated congruously all over her supple body. Her loins softly undulated, and her agile spine swayed and rippled in time as she placidly stirred the pot. I was entranced by the sight and stood in mute admiration, as did that part of me which so far had not intruded. At last I addressed the girl. "How finely, my dear Fotis, how gaily you stir your buttocks as you stand over the pot. What a honeyed relish I see you getting ready. A happy man, a blessed man, is he who you'll let dip finger there." "Oh, be off, you poor fellow," answered the young chatterbox, never at a loss for repartee. "Be off from my fireplace. Keep your distance, for if the tiniest spark of that heat grazes you, you'll be scorched to the gizzard, and no one will be able to quench you but myself, for I'm very good at putting choice spice into pot or bed, and making them both equally stirring." Chattering thus, she glanced at me and smiled, and I did not leave the room until I had diligently scrutinized every angle of her charm. But why divagate into detail? It has always been the prime concern of my life to observe in public the heads and tresses of beautiful women, and then to conjure up the image at home for leisurely enjoyment. This procedure is based on a clear and rationally determined proposition. Firstly, that hair is the most important visible portion of the body, and that from its prominent position it provokes attention first. Secondly, that hair by its natural hues provides that comeliness for the head which the gay tints of flowering dresses provide for the other limbs. Moreover, most women, to commend their natural charms and graces, discard all mufflers, throw open their cloaks, and proudly delight in exhibiting their naked breasts, knowing that there is more delectation in the rosy gloss of the skin than there is in the golden sheen of a dress. On the contrary, though even the supposition is irreligious, and I pray that there may never be an instance of so horrible a monstrosity, if you despoil the most surprisingly beautiful woman of her hair, and denude her face of its natural accommodation, though she were dropped down from heaven, conceived of the sea foam, cradled among the waves, though she, I say, were Venus herself, though she were ringed round by the three graces, and environed by the whole mob of cupids, and laced with her love girdle, fragrant as cinnamon, and dewy with balsamum, yet if she came out bald, she would not be able to seduce even her own husband. What satisfying hues and tangled lusters burn in woman's hair! Sometimes it briskly repels the flesh of the sun, sometimes it's absorbed into a softer penumbra, or glistens with varying toilets of light. Now it coruscates with gold, now it deepens into honey-colored shadows, now it is raven black, now it reflects the blue flower tints of a dove's throat, and then, when it has been anointed with Arabian nard, or parted by the fine teeth of the artful comb, or looped up at the nape of the neck, the lover looks upon it and sees there his own face, as in a mirror, enhanced by delight. Oh, what beauty in hair, whether in braided luxuriance it is twisted together and built up upon the head, or whether it is allowed to tumble in prolix curls down the back. Such, I conclude, is the dignity of hair, that no woman whosoever, though dressed up with gold, tissues, gems, and all other cosmetical apparatus, could be described unless she had duly arranged her hair as dressed at all. But as far as my Fotis was concerned, it was not toilet care but ringleted freedom that crowned her charm. Her plentiful hair, thrown loosely back and hanging down her nape, was scattered over her shoulders and rested softly upon the swelling fringe of her dress, till at last it was gently collected and fastened up by a knot on the top of her head. I could no longer bear the excruciation of such exquisite pleasure, and bending forward, I impressed a most delicious kiss on the spot where the hair was heaped up on the crown of her head. She twisted away and looked at me over her shoulder with sidelong and marrow-sucking glances. Hey now, my scholar, she said, sweet and bitter is the sauce that you lick. Take care that the sweetness of an overdose of honey doesn't choke you bitterly with bile from many a fine day. How is that, my merriment? I asked, for I'm ready to be laid flat for basting above that fire as long as I'm rescued every once in a while by a tiny kiss. And as good as my word, I embraced her more straightly and began kissing her. With that, her own desires kindled, and a mutually waxing ardor twined our bodies akin in love. Cinnamon was the exaltation of her opening mouth, and she succumbed to my kiss, while her quickening tongue ravished me nectarously. I'm going, I said. No, I'm a gone man already, unless you take pity on me. Repeating the exploit of her kiss, she answered, raise up your spirits, man. I am fettered to you by the same leg cuff of desire, and our pleasures won't be delayed very much longer. At the first flicker of torch time, I shall be in your bedroom. So be off and gird yourself ready, for I mean to have a night-long bone to pick with you, and there'll be no flinching on my side. And with some other further similarly pointed remarks, we separated. And a few other things happen until he goes to bed in the hopes that she's going to show up. And what's that?
You're ending on a translation. You're giving your paraphrased version.
No. I'm not ending on the translation. I'm just skipping the parts where there's some other things happen between the time that he's kissed her at the sink and she's told him that she's coming to meet him in the bedroom. And finally I'm gonna read the final little passage of their sex scene, which I just love. So no sooner was I laid in bed. I just want to say some time has passed between that and this. No sooner had I laid in bed than lo, Fotis. Her mistress had now retired for the night, and the girl had come to me, gaily garlanded with roses, and with one rose in full blossom opening between her breasts. She embraced me with fast kisses, and tied a wreath about my head, and strewed flowers all over me. And then she snatched a cup and pouring warm water into it, she proffered me a draught. And before I had finished, she indulgently took the cup away from my lips and sipped the remainder of the wine with little dainty bird-like sips, keeping her eyes intently upon me all the while. Another cup, and then a third we shared thus, passing the cup to and fro, until I was drenched in wine, and every inch of my body partook in my perturbed desire. I felt ticklishly elevated, with all my energies keyed up, and now with one tweak I demonstrated incontestably to my Fotis my straightforward intention. Pity me, I said, come to my succor on the spot, for you can see that I am nervously taut with expectation of this pitched battle to which you have challenged me without any go-between of a herald. Ever since the first arrow of pitiless Cupid twanged in my vitals, I have been standing to arms, and now I'm fairly scared that the bowstrings should snap with overtension. But if you would humor me more richly, let down your wild hair, and while it falls about your shoulders, undulatingly utter lovely embraces. In less than a heartbeat, she had pushed away with one sweep all the plates and dishes, and stripped herself of every stitch. Her hair tumbled down in blithe wantonness, and she stood before me metamorphosed into a Venus, who rose beautifully from the trough of the sea, for a moment of coquettish craft shadowing, it could hardly be called modestly protecting, her depilated femininity with rosy palm. Fight, she said, and fight stoutly, for I won't budge a hairbreadth, nor turn my back. Face to face, I say it, if you're a man, strike home. Maneuver into the position busily and die the death. Today, the battle is waged without quarter. With those words, she leaped into bed, and saddling and bridling me, she rode agilely into pleasure. In the process, she showed herself to possess a spine of pliant lubricity, and she satiated me with the enjoyment of Venus on a swing until, stretched at the last gasp of ecstasy, with languid bodies, we fell, twined in a warm and mortal embrace, pouring out our souls. I want to read that in Latin so bad.
There were two kind of themes. One kind of like hair, the loss of hair, the removal of hair.
The depilation.
Depilation. And There's a moment where they said like a well-coiffed hair allows one to receive or listen to or perceive a woman. And I feel like both of those, there's some moment in there where like you don't listen until the hair is right, or something's not correct until the hair is done proper. And I feel like both of those are this interesting kind of cosmetic applications to our debate about like, how do you arrive at the essence of a person or the purity, or like, what does it mean to be pure, or what is it, what is too much and what is too little, right? One is the removal of something, hair, and another is the addition of something, kind of haircut or manicure.
It's funny you see a haircut as the addition of something.
Well, because it's an well, sorry, not haircut, hairstyle,
Right.
hairstyle,
Okay.
hair
Yes.
presence. Yeah, so one's the removal of body hair, and the other is the kind of like coiffing of hair.
Well, it also says that if a woman removes her clothes, she becomes more beautiful. But if you remove the hair, she'd become not able to seduce even her own husband.
Right. And so then, but I mean,
one is like artificial and better to discard, and one is part of her essence.
well, not to make too much of a bridge, but like I think about that in each individual word in those translations, like this Wang Wei Deer Hermitage Deer Park translation, right? Like each word has to deal with this fundamental core question of, are you enhancing the fundamental underlying form, or are you detracting from it by virtue of your addition?
Right.
And I think that's the question. That's the question in sexuality. It's the question in male and female kind of like positions in society. Like, what do we add? Do we add masculine traits? Do we remove feminine traits? Do we add middle traits, neutrality? Do we, like in a compilation, if a person is a compilation of preferences or personality traits, or derived by language if you need them to be, like, is the quickest way to get at the essence of a person the removal of some things or the addition of things? Right. And I feel like that's the heart of this.
Okay. We're almost an hour in, so please comment and join this, I think, very, very important and deep conversation that is impossible to ever get to the bottom of, probably, for better or worse. See you tomorrow.
Goodbye. See you tomorrow.